Cool. So this is not a security boundary, breaking forest trusts. So my name is Will Schrader. My handle is Harmjoy. It's my obligatory picture. I think that might have been from Walter. I forget. At the little Yoda. But I'm a red teamer and offensive engineer at SpectreOps off in the US. I've written a lot of code, talked at a few conferences, but I was a co-founder of the Bloodhound Project, PowerShell Empire, written a bunch of stuff for PowerSploit, Rubius, a bunch of fun things, some of which we'll be using in this talk.
And so my name's Lee Christensen. I go by Tifkin on Twitter. I do a lot of things at SpectreOps. I work on red teams. I work on our hunt side, building detections, and I also like to do research. A lot of times I'm in the background because I hate writing, so not blog posts or anything, but always am collaborating with Will on things.
Yep. So this bug is a really cool, what we're going to be talking about is a really cool combination of some of Lee's work and then some of the stuff that I've done concerning domains and trusts. So we're excited for it. But first though, one of the crux of part of this talk is forest as this concept of security boundaries. And security boundary is a very definitive, real type of concept in Microsoft and Microsoft circles. So when something is a security boundary, if you're able to breach that boundary, it's supposed to be fixed. We argued that forests were treated as security boundary as per Microsoft documentation because they literally said forests are security boundaries and say a security boundary, security boundary, security boundary. So we're going to go over how we approached actually chaining a couple of interesting misconfigurations or default functionality to break this concept of forest as a security boundary protection. So we're just going to give a super high overview first, then we're going to dive into a lot of the details so people can hopefully understand all the components of this. So, okay, we know that forests are boundaries. But what if we had a computer in forest A that authenticates to a system in forest B? Normal behavior. Bonus, and this will be relevant later, but bonus if we could force a computer in forest A to authenticate to a specific computer we want in forest B. And then what if full ticket granting tickets, TGTs, could move across the forest boundaries from forest A to forest B? And we had a way to easily extract and reuse these ticket granting tickets while in forest B. So we're in a completely separate forest, and there's supposed to be a boundary between these two, but if you could coerce authentication and somehow you can get these ticket granting tickets to flow over that boundary and re-extract them in the other domain, then there might be some interesting ways that you could mess with this concept of forest as security boundaries.
So we already mentioned some nomenclature that you may or may not be familiar with. So we're going to dive really quickly into Kerberos really fast. And we realize Kerberos is a massive topic, so we aren't going to go into every nitty-gritty detail behind it. We definitely don't have time. But we'll focus on the major points that are going to be relevant to this specific bug.
And as always, we'll post this deck after. There's a link from Sean Metcalf that has a complete in-depth, kind of Kerberos overview.
So Kerberos TLDR, when you say a person gets on their computer, on their keyboard, they type in their password, they're authenticating to the domain controller. How does that actually happen? They encrypt a piece of data and they send it to the DC, and then the DC validates that that was encrypted with their password. If the DC validates that that password was correct, it returns what's called a ticket granting ticket, so a TGT. A TGT contains inside of it a PAC, the privileged authentication attribute certificate. Inside of the PAC, it contains information about that user who just authenticated. So that includes the user's security identifier and any group SIDs that that user may also be a part of. So the PAC is what kind of identifies that user and the groups that they belong to. So once the user has a TGT, the user may want to access a service. So in that case, the user presents their ticket granting ticket to the domain controller and requests a service ticket. So they send their TGT to the DC requesting a service ticket, and assuming that TGT is valid, the DC is going to return a service ticket. So now the user has a TGT and a service ticket. That service ticket also contains those SIDs, the group SIDs and the user SIDs that identify the user. So once the user has a service ticket, he presents that ticket to whatever service he wants to access. So if it's a file share, he's going to send the service ticket over SMB to the file share. The file share is then going to decide whether to grant that user access to resources on the file share.
So everyone's a Kerberos expert now. Like, it all makes perfect sense.
Yep. We will be reviewing a lot of this. This is for reference. We do want to mention one slight change. We didn't tell you everything. When there's authentication between multiple domains, there's one extra step. So again, this is us requesting a TGT, step number 1. We're getting the TGT in 2. And then if we're trying to access a different forest or a different domain, there's a step where you get a referral ticket to the other domain.
Inter-realm ticket granting ticket.
And that's the inter-realm ticket granting ticket. And so there's just an extra step there that we'll dive into later on because it's going to become relevant.
All right, so that's Kerberos in 3 minutes, and it makes perfect sense. We're going to cover a concept in Windows Active Directory and Kerberos called delegation, which was touched on a little bit yesterday in a couple of talks, and Andy talked about it and Dirk talked about it, but we're going to give our overview of it. So in general, there's a reason that delegation is needed in Active Directory. So the canonical example is if you have like a front-end web server that people authenticate to, then that web server might need to pretend to be that user when talking to, say, a backend database. So that user asks to the front-end server needs to pretend to be a particular user to a backend. So there is a reason that delegation is needed. We've talked to a few people about some of the recent delegation type attacks and abusive functionality, and a lot of people are like, why does this even exist? Like, there's a reason it needs to exist. Services need to be able to impersonate or pretend to be users to other backend components. So how does Microsoft do this? There's 3 different ways. The original OG way back in Windows 2000 or domain functional level 2000 is they introduced something called unconstrained delegation. This is going to be what we're focusing on. There's also traditional constrained delegation that uses S for U2 self, S for U2 proxy. That was introduced in domain functional level, I forget, 2008 or no, it was they did a bunch of Kerberos extensions and the S4U extensions and all this kind of stuff. There's also, and this is what was touched on in the talks yesterday, there's some more recent resource-based constrained delegation that was introduced with Windows Server 2012 R2, I think. That it's just like a different way to constrain the delegation like to the particular target. So the target says only certain people can like delegate to me and all that kind of stuff. We're focusing on, again, is unconstrained, the most dangerous and kind of the original. So with unconstrained delegation, a user will request a forwarded TGT, and it'll send this along with the service ticket when it's authenticating to remote service. The remote service will extract the ticket granting ticket out of that exchange, and then it'll cache that ticket granting ticket for a period of time on the machine. So if I auth to the front-end service, and I'm doing this with unconstrained delegation, that front-end service now has my ticket granting ticket and can pretend to be me to any other service in the entire domain. Hopefully this seems like it might be slightly scary to people because unconstrained delegation is very, very dangerous. Microsoft realized this. That's why they introduced the constrained or more restricted flavors of delegation in the past few years. The reason it's very, very dangerous is if an attacker can compromise a server with unconstrained delegation, they can obtain a TGT for any non-protected user who authenticates to that server. So people that aren't in the protected users groups or don't have this account is sensitive and cannot be delegated setting, which sadly most places don't take advantage of those like they should. But anyways, I compromise a random unconstrained delegation server, and then anyone that authenticates to it, I can extract their TGTs out of memory and then pretend to be that person. So the classic attack scenario for this that I think Sean Metcalf talked about was kind of like a watering hole type attack. Or if you compromise this type of server, maybe you send like a UNC link in an email to an admin, or you do like an LNK file on a file share. Somehow you're trying to coerce people to connect to basically your capture server. And one note is in modern domains, only domain controllers by default are configured for unconstrained delegation. So even the most modern domains, you are guaranteed to have at least one server with unconstrained delegation in the environment. So this is very, very important for this bug. But beside that, we've seen many environments that have misconfigurations to where, like something with machine provisioning to where like all servers have unconstrained delegation or desktops have it. And this is a big enough of a security issue that we actually have, like there's built-in queries, right, Andy, for Bloodhound to like find all paths to unconstrained servers and things like that. So you can analyze this stuff with Bloodhound. Highly recommend you do.
Yeah. Again, just the big takeaway, if I as an attacker compromise an unconstrained delegation server, anytime somebody authenticates to that server, I can impersonate that user. So I have their TGT and can impersonate that user.
So what does this kind of look like? And these are my super hacked together screenshots. But if we have the server primary it has the trusted for delegation bit flipped in its user account control attribute. So this is like a binary blob of a bunch of different things that control different account behavior. So the trusted for delegation bit, when it's flipped, that means unconstrained delegation. So I'm just showing you primary has unconstrained delegation enabled. If I'm on a different system and I'm like testlab DA, and then I just do like a directory listing of that primary server of $, I have access to do that, it goes through. In the back end, my TGT is going to be sent with that service ticket request and everything in the process. And the end result is my DA ticket granting ticket is going to be, at least for a short period of time, if not longer, it's going to be in the memory of that primary machine. So we're just proving to you what we had on the last slide. You can see, all right, the KRB TGT, that's the server name, that's my TGT. And anyone who has administrative access on that primary server can then extract my ticket granting ticket and pretend to be me. Very dangerous.
So unconstrained delegation is one component. Another thing that we need to review is domain trusts. So quick background on trusts. Trusts link authentication systems of two different domains. So if you have multiple domains inside of a forest, or even multiple forests with domains inside of it, this allows you to authenticate to those other domains. So one user can access potentially the resources in other domains. So again, the whole purpose is just to allow this authentication to flow between each domain. How this works is when a trust is set up, what gets created is a thing called a inter-realm trust key. So this is just an encryption key that's used to encrypt Kerberos referral tickets. So if I'm a user and I want to access a resource in another domain, during the Kerberos process, one of those tickets is encrypted using the inter-realm trust key that's created. So there's these different referrals that go on, again, when I'm accessing that other domain. Again, it's just that inter-realm trust key encrypts the inter-realm ticket granting ticket. So once I talk to my domain controller and I say, hey, I want to access this resource in another domain, it returns a referral ticket encrypted with this inter-realm key. And then I send that to the domain controller in the other domain. And because it's encrypted with that key, it knows that it's a valid TGT. And then I can receive a service ticket from that domain controller.
And fundamentally, trusts are weird to where they seem really simple, but also they're really complicated. To where this really is all a trust is these two domains exchange a key, and they can like issue referrals between each other. That's it. It gets really, really complicated with exactly how the referrals are honored depending on the different trust types and the different kind of characteristics that we're going to be going through.
Yep. So like you said, there's different kinds of trusts. So, and trusts have direction and transitivity. So first type of trust is a one-way trust. So domain A trusts domain B. So it's one directional. Then there's also two-way trust, which in reality is just two one-way trusts. So A trusts B and B trusts A. That means authentication can flow from A to B or B to A. And that's going to be the one that we're going to focus on primarily here. Trusts also have a property called transitivity. So this is just saying if A trusts B and B trusts C, therefore A implicitly also trusts C. So
they don't have to be transitive. It's just, it can be transitive or non-transitive.
yeah. So you have the direction and the transitivity. Then there's also different trust types. You have intra-forest. So that's if you have everything inside of a single forest, a single active directory forest. So the types there are parent-child, which is probably the most common that you'll see. And then you have cross-link, which is just it's just another type that helps.
A shortcut trust, but yeah.
Then you also have interdomain forest trusts. So if you have multiple forests inside of your environment, you may create these forest trusts. Forest A may want to trust one of the domains in Forest B. Likewise, you may have an external trust as well. So it's just another way that you can connect those two disparate forests together.
So external trusts are between two like single one-off domains. Microsoft actually doesn't really recommend these. They actually recommend forest trusts because it's much easier to get Kerberos working completely correctly between multiple domains. So, but again, basically we're going to go over that things within the same forest, there is no guarantee of a boundary, and we'll go over why. Things between two forests, they were supposed to be like isolated. And we'll go over the exact security protections.
So like we mentioned before, so when you authenticate, you get a ticket granting ticket. Inside of that ticket granting ticket is the privileged account certificate. So that's inside of the TGT. The TGT, inside of that pack, it contains information about who the user is and the groups that that user is a part of. So, and that's made possible through security identifiers. So a different way of looking at this is you have your TGT there, and then you have the pack on the inside there containing various fields. So you have a field that identifies the user itself, and that's by their SID. You have different groups that user may belong to. And then you may also have, there's like this extra SIDS field that's used for...
That we'll cover.
Yep, that we'll dive into in just a little bit. So you have your pack, and there's something important that happens when you're authenticating to other domains. It's this thing called SID filtering. So when you authenticate to a separate domain, so I get a TGT and then I want to authenticate to another domain. During that authentication process, the remote domain controller I'm trying to access is going to analyze the SIDs that are inside of my TGT's pack. So you have those group SIDs that I claim I am a part of. So the remote domain controller is going to analyze those, and depending on the type of trust that we have with that domain, it's going to filter the SIDs inside of my pack. So what we mean by filter is it may just remove them. And which SIDs get removed depends. And again,
there's a long set of rules in MS Pack. We have the link there. There's a large, giant table of rules, like depending on this, these are in these situations filtered, but these aren't. And everything
this
else.
Trust type, then remove these SIDs.
Yep.
If it's this kind of trust, do this. So for reference, go look at that document. But the important thing is that when you're authenticating between two different forests, so just as an example, if I'm in Forest A trying to get into Forest B, the TGTs, one of the common filters that occurs is that my ticket, so when I try and access a different forest, my ticket should not contain privileged groups in the other forest.
So like domain admins, enterprise admins, like these highly privileged groups.
So what happens is even if I have those SIDs in my pack, in my ticket, when I authenticate to that other domain, it's actually going to remove them so that when I get a ticket back, I'm not actually going to have those privileges. That being said, it's only for those defined privileged groups in those rules. So you may be able to inject other SIDs that aren't filtered. So why do we mention this? So SID filtering's whole purpose is to, well, one of the effects of SID filtering is it prevents a trusted domain or forest from compromising a trusting domain or forest. So if you set up if you set up two brand new forests and you create a trust between them, like a bidirectional trust, just because you have those trusts set up, does not mean that one forest should now be able to compromise the other forest. And so why that's the case is due to SID filtering.
Yeah. This is the main security protection. That was the enforcement of this security boundary concept with Active Directory forests. So but also we're going to dive right back in and touch on some Benjamin Delpy work along with some of the stuff he did with Metcalfe a couple of years ago. But this is why the domain itself is not a security boundary. So we talked about in that MS Pack documentation this giant set of rules that says these certain SIDs are filtered out and other ones aren't. So there's a specific filtering rule called forest specific. And these are for SIDs that are never allowed in a pack that originates from outside the forest. So within this is enterprise admins. So you notice it says originates from outside the forest, not outside the domain. So the SID for enterprise admins is not filtered out. Like I just mentioned, if both domains are within the same forest. So if you can somehow set the SID history of your ticket granting ticket to be enterprise admins, which you can do this with Mimikatz, you can escalate from a child domain to any forest root domain. So when I first learned this a couple of years ago, I remember messaging Benjamin and was like, does this work how I think it works? And he said, sorry for your head, and sent me some gif of someone's like head exploding. And I was like, I ran to my boss, I was like, guys, you don't understand. This is the coolest thing ever. And they were like, what are you talking about? Stop. We just want to eat dinner, man. Like, stop. Just shut up. So this was really, really cool to me because before when we attack a lot of forest and we attack a lot of domain trusts and things when we do Active Directory engagements. So before, if we compromise the child domain, you have a forest, lots of branches, lots of domains within it. If we compromise a child domain all the way down that forest tree, we would have to like manually walk our way up to the forest root to try to compromise the whole thing. But now, if you compromise domain admin credentials for 5 minutes in any child domain in the entire forest, you DC sync, and you get the carry TGT of that child domain, and you just put /SIDS for the extra SIDS in your forged golden ticket, and you set the SIDS to be enterprise admins of the forest root. You can hop from that child domain all the way up to the top instantly in just a couple of minutes. We have done this in the field. It's super, super cool.
And again, the reason why this works is because even though we're accessing other domains, because it's intra-forest, the enterprise admin SID is not getting filtered.
Yep.
Whereas if we were trying to access a different forest, this would not work.
Yep. And then we have our obligatory, we have Benjamin there.
Hi, Ben.
So now, but we keep kind of hammering this, but that protection was supposed to protect forests themselves. So SID filtering in these sensitive groups does protect across forest boundaries. This is why people had said for a long time the forest is a security boundary. There is not supposed to be a way, if you compromise forest A that has a trust of forest B, to then compromise the other external one. And again, security boundary, security boundary, security boundary, security boundary, according to Microsoft. A couple other little caveats though, because I swear literally half our job is just reading Microsoft documentation, which is super fun. But within those docs, there were a couple things that started to pop up in the fall when we were reading these things. So one, in some of their documentation, they say when users authenticate from a trusted forest, they receive the authenticated user's SID in their token. This is going to be very important later. But this is why, if you have a forest-to-forest trust, you can query any LDAP information from a foreign forest because that's a basic authenticated user type of permission. What's even more interesting is a server can use a delegated ticket granting ticket to connect as a user to any server, including those across a one-way trust. This is kind of the crux of this entire bug, is that delegated ticket granting tickets will work across forest trust boundaries.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot. Just as a quick review, so delegated ticket granting tickets are usable across forest boundaries. So if there's a machine in a separate forest that authenticates to a machine that authenticates to an unconstrained delegation server in my forest, then I can impersonate whoever authenticated to my machine, even if it's in another forest.
Yeah,
So, yep. And so that means, as the attacker can impersonate a user in a different forest. So that begs the question, can we coerce any accounts in a remote forest to authenticate to our forest? And why, yes, we can. And that's where the printer bug comes in handy. So the printer bug is a little feature. I wouldn't really even call it a bug.
Yeah, it's not a bug. It's a feature that will not be fixed.
Yes. So it abuses an old protocol that's enabled by default. So it's the Print System Remote Protocol, MSRPRN. It's a well-documented protocol. It's on MSDN, and that's how I found it, was reading through the documentation on this specific protocol. Inside of that protocol, there's a RPC method called RPC Remote Find First Printer Change Notification X. There's two of them, actually. And so the whole purpose of this RPC method is you connect to a printer and you may want to be notified when a print job occurs. So you say, send me a notification every time there's a new print job. But there's a feature of this that during the setup of this notification, essentially I can just say, hey print server, please notify me. Please notify my computer whenever there's a new print job. During that setup, that causes the remote print server to authenticate back to me. So the TLDR is, I'm on computer A, computer B is over there. When I use this, computer B is going to authenticate to me.
With this machine account.
With its machine account. So this allows us to coerce authentication. So this is handy in a lot of different scenarios, but and it's worth noting that this is only one technique. Microsoft has said that in a future version, they might disable this, but for now, it still works quite well. So just a few details behind it, like that's some protocol information. One thing I do want to note is it's on TCP 445. It's using SMB RPC, so that's exposed a lot in environments. Likewise, this is very important to note, is the RPC server is accessible by authenticated users on Windows greater than 8. So
remember when I mentioned that very specific thing of between like interforce stuff, when you get that referral, you have authenticated users in your SID. So this means that anyone in Forest A can trigger the printer callback coerced authentication bug in Forest B.
So this is just an example of kind of what it looks like. So at the top, I am on a machine called Win10. I'm running as the user marketer, a low privileged user in the domain. And then I'm using a tool called Spool Sample, which is an implementation of this. And all it's saying is, I'm using Spool Sample and saying labdc, so that's a domain controller, please authenticate to the Windows 10 machine. So again, I'm running as the marketer user, super low privileged. I executed that. And now when I look at the logon events, I'm using Seatbelt, which is one of our tools. When I look at the logon events, I can see that the domain controller account authenticated back to the Windows 10 machine.
So this seems, hopefully this seems as bad to other people as it does to us, or like low privilege or non-privileged users. It doesn't seem like they should be allowed to force certain machines to authenticate to other machines. Lee had reported this a while back, and the general opinion, I believe, from like Microsoft and everybody is like, well, they're machine accounts, so by default, there's not a way that you can abuse like this machine account coerced authentication. So Lee's kind of been on a crusade to try to prove that no, machine accounts can be very, very useful from an authentication standpoint, like offensively. And this is one application with the trust bug, and we're about to put all the pieces together, where we are able to use these machine accounts in a very interesting way. All right, so let's smash some Forest Trust, put all the pieces together. here's our scenario. An attacker completely compromises forest B. Like I had mentioned, you're always going to have at least one server in a forest or a domain that has unconstrained delegation. So we're in control of forest B's domain controller that has unconstrained delegation. Forest B has a two-way forest trust with forest A. No other configuration, no other nested groups, no other anything. This is it. Stock as you can possibly get. The tools we're going to be using in this scenario are going to be Rubius for TGT monitoring and extraction, the spool sample implementation for coerced authentication of the printer bug, and then of course Mimikatz with DC sync. So this is what we're going to do. We have our compromised forest, forest B. We have our victim forest, forest A. We've compromised this little DCB guy right here. So from here, I'm going to say, hey, domain controller A, please authenticate to domain controller B. And I can do this with that, with the RPC printer bug. And when this happens, DCA is going to authenticate back to DCB with its machine account. So I'm going to get that DCA dollar account that's going to authenticate over SMB to domain controller B. And it'll send its ticket granting ticket because of unconstrained delegation and those default trust settings that allow delegated tickets to flow across forest boundaries. So these first two parts, this is the printer bug, and we can trigger the printer bug in the foreign forest because that authenticated user SID, that group, is the only permission we need by default to trigger this. And then DCA's machine account TGT is going to flow back because of default trust settings. The attacker will then extract DC dollars ticket granting ticket out of memory, which we can do because we're admin on the server. We're going to submit that to LSA. And now it is as if we are DCA dollar, and then we can just DC sync DCA dollar and compromise all the credential material in the forest for forest A. So this is the entire attack. There's not a ton of moving pieces. It's just kind of chaining together a couple of these things of, oh, coerced authentication, pull the ticket out, and you're basically doing almost like Kerberos ticket reflection back to the server. It is kind of funny to me that like DCA will accept a DC synchronization request from itself from a different location. That's kind of weird, but anyways, that's how it works. So this is a video. Should start playing. So I know the text is a little small. We can't zoom, unfortunately. But anyways, we have forest A as a two-way trust of forest B. We're going to start monitoring for new ticket granting tickets on this domain controller B that we've compromised. We're going to trigger the printer bug against domain controller A from domain controller B. It's going to be waiting. This is that we see 4624 events. We see the blob of the ticket granting ticket for DCA. This is through Rubius. I'm just going to pull the base64 representation of that out. I'm going to just replace all the new lines. My super awesome regex skills. All right. Okay, so now we have a base64 blob that is DCA's ticket granting ticket. We're going to describe it just to like prove to you that, yep, it's DCA, KRB TGT. Then we're going to pass the ticket with this blob. So we're going to import that. Now it is as if we are domain controller A. And then we're going to Mimikatz DC sync forest A, the foreign forest. And then we compromise the entire set of credential material. So that's a complete separate forest compromise that, you know, even though this was a security boundary, we're able to do that. So the TLDR is the compromise of any server with unconstrained delegation, domain controller or otherwise, can not only be leveraged to compromise the current domain in any domains in the current forest, but you can compromise any and all domains in any foreign forest that you share a two-way forest trust with. So we think that's bad. And we're going to explain exactly why we think it's really, really bad. But when we published this, it was in the fall. We published an offensive blog post and also a complete set of defensive and mitigation guidance from one of our blue teamers. But some of the public reaction, it was mostly good, and there's a lot of people being like, oh, this is crazy. But some of the other reactions were like, there's still a security boundary as long as it's not a two-way trust in an 80 forest domain. So if a forest is a security boundary if it doesn't have a trust with anything, I'm like, all right, okay. Have forest root domain admin credentials have things grossly misconfigured. So I guess a stock domain trust is gross misconfiguration, according to this person. I don't think I've ever heard anyone claim a boundary exists when a two-way trust is in place, even though Microsoft says that in their documentation. So, you know, I think there was just some we're not trying to like poke fun at stuff. We just think there were some misconceptions with how people understood this problem and what the promise of that boundary was in Microsoft documentation. Microsoft themselves were a little bit kind of unclear of like, well, boundary and whatever, but we made the argument that based on the documentation and based on the SID filtering protection, that there was supposed to be a security enforcement between these two external forests with a stock with like a stock trust configuration. So why this matters?
So the big thing is that this is going to work in the default configuration of any forest that has a two-way trust. So it's extremely powerful in that sense. You don't have to do anything. All you have to do is set up a two-way trust, and this is going to work.
And we tried really hard to make sure that the stock demos and examples and everything we did were just like patched, real, like up to date, at least 2012 or higher operating systems with just a stock trust. So we didn't do any weird nested group configuration. We didn't like, you know, mess with anything. We wanted to keep everything as default and stock as possible.
Yeah. That also mimics the quote unquote most secure implementation that you may have, which, you know, is having no extra groups. So one of the big implications of this now is, you know, if you have two forests that trust each other, Forest A and Forest B, the security of one forest is completely dependent on the security of another forest.
So think about acquisitions to where if you have a company that purchases other companies and they're like, okay, the Microsoft guidance says that the domain's not the boundary, so we're going to just do a forest-to-forest trust because we need to link up authentication systems and have everything brought in. But they're like, oh, this is a boundary, so we're doing this correctly because we just have external forest-to-forest trust. So, you know, they acquire some other company that may have already been owned, and they're like, okay, no, we're totally safe because we have this forest-to-forest boundary. Like, the compromise of the newly acquired company can be used to completely compromise, you know, like the acquiring company. So it's just that, yeah, again, the security of each forest is completely dependent on each other, which is scary.
And again, yeah, even if the way that we tried to set up all of our examples was even if Forest A has near perfect security, so like even if it's default configuration, no other users, there's very few moving pieces. If something in Forest A is compromised, then you can compromise Forest B. So when we do want to give a shout out to Microsoft. So we reported this to MSRC back in the fall. When they first triaged it, we had some back and forth going with them. They decided to call it a won't fix. It wasn't an issue. So we went ahead and we published our details and a bunch of defensive guidance on it. And it got, let's just say it was shuffled around within Microsoft, and some people who had a bigger stake in the game there decided to escalate it.
Yeah, so to their credit, they decided that that decision was a mistake. They released an advisory early in the spring. We've been working with them back and forth. They released an advisory. We're going to talk about a patch here in just a little bit, but we definitely want to applaud Microsoft and MSRC for saying, like, we made a mistake, you know, and they've been handling the situation like extremely, extremely well since then. They've been amazing to work with. So it's, you know, I don't know. The situation could have ended up a little bit better if the determination originally was this is an issue that we're going to fix. That would have been the ideal situation. But they're doing everything they can to actually squash this entire bug in the coming months. So we'll go over the specifics. Because they actually released a CVE last week. So we have Active Directory Elevation of Privilege Vulnerability. So we actually got a full CVE. They like completely recognize this. So to anyone that was claiming, like, is this an issue or was this a boundary or not? Like, Microsoft says it was because they are going to fix it.
Yeah.
So the defenses, a little bit on some of this stuff, and then we'll cover the patch.
So the first one is called selective authentication, which is just, again, the true fix is going to be to install the patch. but you potentially can use selective authentication as a way to prevent or to protect the accounts that are allowed to authenticate across the trusts. Typically, this is primarily focused on administrative users.
It can potentially be possible. We haven't actually seen anybody that's implemented this for like domain controller accounts because we think DCs need to be able to authenticate to each other in a lot of situations to do proper, whatever between all the weird stuff that happens under the hood. But for the sake of being complete, we wanted to like give a shout out that selective auth theoretically can block this attack.
And then another thing that you can do is to just disable TGT delegation across the trust. So since 2012 R2, there's been a feature on the trusted domain objects called Enable TGT Delegation No, or Enable TGT Delegation. And you can set that, you can disable that so that delegation cannot occur across those trusts.
So this just flips a bit on that trusted domain object. One key here is that this needs to be done on each end of the trust, because if you only do this on like A, then like you can still compromise in the other direction. But what's really cool is the CVE 2019-06-83 details. So they recently released this patch. And this is just, we haven't fully tested all the components of the patch. This is based on their documentation of what they're going to be doing. They're slowly rolling this patch out that disables TGT delegation across forest boundaries by default, which is awesome. On the roadmap, they're going to be implementing a new safe configuration for unconstrained Kerberos delegation across trusts. So how are they going to be doing this? A little bit on the timeline. So a couple days ago, they actually backported the full delegation block to server 2008 and 2008 R2. So this used to only be a feature in server 2012. So first step, awesome. They backported the stuff. The second step in a few months is they're going to be introducing a new flag. And they've stated, in case you do need Kerberos full delegation across trusts, they're introducing this new flag. I don't know what the flag name is going to be. They didn't have it in the documentation. Along with this, any new trust will have enabled TGT delegation set to no. So they're basically, with this step, they're giving people a chance. They're giving people a window saying, if you do still need this feature, like here's your chance to flip this and still allow it to happen. Because then in July, they're going to start enforcing the new flag that they implement, and they're going to completely ignore the enabled TGT delegation flag. So the reason they're doing it like this, of like introducing a related but separate flag to block this stuff, is this is a way to deal with the backwards compatibility problem. So when this thing comes out, they're like, hey, if you actually want this, you better flip this flag to specifically say yes, because once it hits in July, they're going to completely ignore the old one. So once this flips over in July, any updated DCs will no longer be vulnerable to this particular attack and this particular issue, unless they explicitly went in and actually explicitly enabled full delegation across TGTs across forest boundaries. And based on like some of the admins and some of the environments we know, like I doubt many people are really going to need that or realize that they might even need it. So this is a way for them to say, all right, we're doing the right thing and giving you a window in case you need this functionality, but then we're flipping the switch and this whole bug class will be dead.
Yeah, so to their credit, they're breaking it. Like they're going to stop the attack.
But until then, it's still going to work. So
enjoy it while you can.
Okay. So that's the talk. I don't know if there will be any questions. Also, we'll put the slide deck up and like tweet it. We have like some references to the slides and like the timelines and all the details and things like that. We'll also be hanging out in case people want to talk to us after. But are there any questions right now?
How does this change when you look at one-way inbound trusts?
One-way inbound trust. So the blog post does cover that, specifically if you're talking about ESAE or Red Forest. Right now, the attack only works with two-way forest trust, because in one direction, you get the authenticated SIDs to trigger the bug, and then the trust needs to be also in the other direction to have the delegated TGT to flow back. So you have to have both directions. So one direction is for the trigger, and one direction is to capture the TGT coming back.
Thank you, guys.